mother once told him he had the qualities of a shaman, that the spirits were always protecting him. She warned him that if he didn't follow that path, he'd find himself in big trouble one day. So she forced him to study all sorts of religious things, magic, and poetry he'd never even heard of. But he didn't want any of it. He already knew what he wanted in life, so he just focused on his studies instead. 10 years passed just like that. And then, just as his mother had said, trouble found him. But the most surprising part wasn't the trouble itself. It was the fact that he was reborn. Everything she had said was true. A next life really did exist. He finally understood that some things can't be known until you've been through them yourself. So that brings us to what he's doing now. He announced that class was starting. As a new teacher at a magic academy, he was here to teach his students about magic circle activation. It was a strange turn of events, but this was his life now. He had arrived in the Empire's capital, a massive city covered in snow. The train station was massive, bustling with people getting ready to leave. He walked up to the conductor to get his ticket checked. The conductor smiled and took the ticket to check it. After a quick look, he handed it back and wished him a good trip. With that done, he stepped onto the train. He checked his ticket again, cabin 403, fourth carriage. He walked down the narrow hallway until he found it. He opened the door and saw that someone was already inside, quietly reading. The older man looked up from his newspaper and offered a simple hello. The traveler gave a polite nod in return. With everyone on board, the train let out a huge puff of smoke. The massive wheels began to turn, picking up speed. Soon, it was speeding through the snowy countryside. The train cut through the quiet, cold mountains. Inside the cabin, the two men sat in a comfortable silence. The older gentleman went back to his paper, and the traveler opened a book. He looked up for a moment, just listening to the rhythm of the train. The older man broke the silence, reading a headline from his newspaper. He announced that the civil war in the Yuta kingdom was finally over. According to the article, the princess's side had won. My companion looked up from his own paper, agreeing that the war was finally over. The older man seemed to be thinking about it for a moment. He said he'd been wondering for a while when it would finally end. I agreed, adding that the prince's faction had been gaining power lately, so it was good the conflict didn't drag on. The older man decided it was time for introductions. He said his name was Rudiger Chelsea. I told him my name was just Gerard, and he guessed I must be from a noble family. I quickly explained that I was from a fallen noble family, trying to put him at ease. Our conversation continued as the train sped through the snowy landscape. Rudiger asked where I was headed. I told him I was going to the Empire's capital, Lindenborough, since I'd heard it was a famous tourist spot. He agreed that the Empire was a great place to visit because of its advanced magic. He then mentioned he was on his way to a city called Leatherbelk. That's when he told me he was a new member of Thean Academy, the most famous school in the Empire. I was pretty surprised to hear that. I told him he must be incredibly skilled to get in. He just got a little flustered and said he barely passed the test. But I told him he should be proud of himself, since so many people failed to get into that academy. He thanked me for the kind words. Then he leaned in a bit, saying our talk about the Civil War reminded him of a rumor he'd heard. He told me that the real hero of the war wasn't some high-ranking knight or a powerful mage. Turns out, it was a wandering mercenary named Machiavelli who led the princess's side to victory. The name definitely caught my attention. I just listened, letting him continue. Rudiger noticed his new friend's calm reaction. He laughed, insisting that the story about the mercenary Machiavelli wasn't just some rumor. Rudiger had no idea how right he was. The protagonist had created the Machiavelli persona specifically to search for a certain object. It was just one of the many names he'd used over the years, before changing his identity again. To steer the conversation away from his past, the protagonist asked Rudiger if he'd be in charge of a class as soon as he arrived at the academy. Rudiger happily confirmed that he'd be teaching the second years. The protagonist was surprised. That was a huge responsibility for a new teacher, meaning Rudiger was far more skilled than he let on. Rudiger must have noticed the look on his face, because he leaned in and asked if something was wrong. But before the protagonist could answer, Rudiger's own expression changed. He suddenly went rigid, sensing something outside the train. Suddenly, a huge explosion ripped through the side of the train. The force of the blast threw them across the car. Gerard yelled out, trying to figure out what was happening. He wondered if the engine had exploded, but that didn't make any sense. The train's engine was protected by magic. That's when Rudiger understood exactly what this was. He told Gerard it was an ambush. The idea of being attacked on this specific train seemed impossible. Gerard's mind started racing. It had to be a robbery targeting the wealthy passengers. And an explosion that powerful meant one thing: a mage was involved. Gerard thought they should hide, but Rudiger stopped him. The teacher insisted on taking the lead just in case. Gerard watched him go. Turns out this teacher was more interesting than he first thought. Ludger moved carefully down the empty train car. He confirmed they were the only ones left in their carriage. Gerard turned to him, wondering if the other passengers would be safe. He thought the magic on their cabins would be enough to protect them. Ludger immediately told him that was a bad idea. Since the train's main protection was broken, the individual cabins were no longer safe. Gerard was still trying to make sense of it. He pointed out the explosion came from the car right next to them and wondered why no one had escaped to their side. Then it hit him. If he were a robber, he'd target the first-class carriage where all the wealthy passengers were. Gerard felt a wave of relief, thinking they were lucky to be in the back. Ludger seemed to agree with his thinking. He told Ludger this was their chance. They could escape through the rear cars while the attackers were busy up front. But before they could even move, an attacker kicked the door right off its hinges, crashing into their carriage. Ludger stood his ground, cane held ready. He yelled at the attacker to back off. The attacker saw Ludger sweating and thought he looked weak. He figured this would be easy. The man rushed forward swinging a knife, but Ludger just leaned out of the way, dodging it completely. In that same moment, a bright blue energy started crackling in his hand. He slammed his palm into the attacker's chest. The man screamed as the energy sent him flying backward. The attacker hit the floor and didn't move. Ludger stood over him, not even breathing hard. Gerard stared in shock, asking if Ludger had just taken the man down for good. Ludger calmly explained he'd only knocked him out. Gerard warned him that it was still dangerous, but Ludger just walked toward the body, saying he was going to question him. But before he could, a massive explosion ripped right through the train car. The whole thing was torn apart in a blast of fire and smoke. Rudiger was thrown to the ground, the force of the blast knocking the wind out of him. Gerard coughed through the dust, calling out to see if Rudiger was all right. His eyes were wide with panic. Rudiger pushed himself up. The hallway was completely destroyed. A huge hole had been blown clean through the side of the car, exposing them to the freezing snow outside. Gerard just stared, his voice trailing off in shock. Gerard's eyes darted around, taking in the destruction. He wiped some dust from his cheek, his expression twisting with anger. But it wasn't the danger that was bothering him. Gerard let out a frustrated sigh, complaining that his expensive tailored suit was ruined. Meanwhile, Rudiger just adjusted his collar, looking completely unfazed by the chaos. He just looked tired. He wondered why these kinds of incidents always seemed to happen whenever he was around. It had been a really tough day. He was getting way too much attention and needed to disappear. Luckily, a princess and her followers were celebrating something, so they weren't paying attention. He used that chance to disguise himself. He hopped on a train heading to a place called Lindenborough, hoping for a clean getaway. But of course, it wasn't that simple. He just couldn't understand why things like this always happened whenever he was around. He turned away from the destruction. This wasn't just some random accident. The bomb had exploded while the whole train was electrified. This wasn't the work of some common robbers. He figured this wasn't about money. This was the work of psychos who wanted to take the entire train down with them. Just then, a train conductor stumbled upon the scene, staring in disbelief at the huge hole blown through the side of the car. Ludger calmly explained that armed robbers were attacking the first carriage, and it would be safer for them to stay back. But the next second, he grabbed the conductor and slammed him hard onto the floor. Pinning the man down, Ludger asked if he really thought his pathetic acting was going to work. He explained that robbers don't just attack a train at full speed. It was also way too convenient that the train's protective spells had suddenly failed. Pulling something like that off would be impossible without an inside man. The conductor's face went pale. He was caught. Ludger's expression turned cold. He was done playing games. But someone else on the train was already making a move. He grabbed the conductor, demanding to know who sent them and what they were after. The man refused to talk, so Ludger put a knife to his throat and started forcing him down the hall. As they moved, Ludger glanced back. Something felt off. That's when he heard it, a faint sound that made his eyes go wide. Before he could react, a woman with a sword flashed past him, striking the conductor. The conductor was thrown down the corridor, his uniform torn to pieces. The woman stood ready, her attack finished in an instant. Just as the chaos seemed to settle, a new group of armed men appeared at the end of the hall, their boots crunching on the broken glass. The leader was stunned. He couldn't believe someone was still alive after all the gunfire. Ludger slowly got to his feet, completely unfazed. He calmly told the men they were dreaming if they thought they could take him down. Furious, the leader screamed at his men to open fire. Ludger didn't even flinch. They pulled their triggers, but the guns just sparked and died. One of the men yelled out that his weapon wasn't working. The leader's eyes shot wide as he stared at the man in the suit, finally understanding what was happening. A set of glowing golden gear spun in Ludger's hand. He was a mage, and he had just used magic to disable all of their weapons. One of the men screamed what everyone was thinking. He was a mage, and he'd used magic to stop their guns from working. The golden gears faded from Ludger's hand as he stood there, completely calm. The leader admitted he never expected to find a mage on this train. He told Ludger to give up, promising a quick end if he didn't fight back. But as he watched, the leader was sizing him up. He figured Ludger had to be a rank 4 mage just like him, since he didn't recognize his face. Ludger wasn't paying attention to the threat. He was calculating. It had already been 10 minutes since the first explosion. He knew they were trapped in the mountains, and just waiting for reinforcements wasn't going to work. So he made his choice. Without any warning, he jumped right out of the hole in the side of the train, leaving the stunned attackers behind. The leader of the attackers couldn't believe it. He screamed at one of his men, Hansen, to go check where Ludger had gone. Hansen leaned out into the freezing wind, but there was nothing. He yelled back that he couldn't see him anywhere. Just then, a single drop of blood landed on one of the men's masks. He froze, realizing something was right above them. They all looked up. Ludger was on the roof of the train. The men were stunned. The leader couldn't understand how flight magic could possibly keep up with a speeding train. He quickly gave new orders, reminding them that a mage was too dangerous for normal people. He told a few to stay behind while the rest continued to the first carriage. The men left behind aimed their guns at the ceiling, waiting for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the leader saw him. Ludger was running toward the back of the train. He yelled for everyone to chase him down. As the attackers chased him, Ludger slipped inside one of the train cars. The next second, a huge explosion ripped through the hallway, catching them completely off guard. One of the men yelled out, wondering how anyone could have set a trap that fast. The leader knew this wasn't normal. This mage was far more efficient and effective than any he'd ever seen. He wasn't fighting like a scholar, he was fighting like a mercenary, like a hunter. His men were completely spooked. That's when the leader's eyes went wide. He finally understood. Ludger was separating the train carriages. He was trying to get away for good. The leader finally understood. Ludger wasn't trying to beat them, he was just trying to get away. With his plan in motion, Ludger sprinted through the detached carriage. He looked back as the main part of the train sped off into the distance. The gap between them grew wider every second, leaving him behind in the quiet, snowy forest. The attackers could only stand there and watch as their target got away. He was furious, but he knew they couldn't give up their main objective just to chase after one guy. He stared out into the snow, swearing he would remember Ludger's face and hunt him down. But then a powerful wave of magical energy washed over them. The leader froze, completely confused. He had no idea where it was coming from. The attacker's eyes went wide. He couldn't understand what was happening. Turns out the source of that power was Ludger. He had somehow appeared right in front of them, a massive golden magic circle already forming in his hands. The attacker panicked, wondering if this was all some kind of trap. Without a word, Ludger unleashed the spell. A huge beam of golden light shot forward, tearing through the train car. The attackers were caught completely off guard. One of them screamed for the others to run, but it was already too late. The blast of light washed over them, taking them all out in an instant. As the golden light faded, a strange dark energy seemed to pull back into his hand. When the smoke cleared, Ludger stood alone in the train car. The attackers were all on the ground, not moving. He looked down at them without any emotion and calmly stated that it was all over. But one of the attackers had somehow survived the blast. He stood there, badly burned, staring at Ludger. He was furious, demanding to know why Ludger would do this to them. The attacker called his group patriots and asked if Ludger had any remorse. Ludger just listened, completely unfazed. He just smirked, finding the whole thing ridiculous. The attacker's anger faltered, replaced by confusion. Ludger finally spoke, his voice cold. He pointed out that they were the ones who attacked first, asking what rate they had to complain now. He then asked the man if he could say the same things to the innocent people they had just tried to get rid of. Ludger reminded him of his earlier threat to hunt him down, calling him pitiful. Ludger's expression was grim. He told the man that this was all his own fault. If only he hadn't seen his face, things might have ended differently. He explained that since the man's group was going to come after him anyway, it was better to just handle things right here and now. Before the man could even react, a huge spike of ice shot forward, piercing straight through his head. He didn't even flinch. Just then, someone else arrived on the scene. A knight in white armor stepped through the wreckage, her expression serious. She looked at Ludger, who was standing calmly by the body, and asked if he was all right. She tried to reassure him, saying not to worry. The cold steel knighthood was here now. The knight stood there with a cocky grin, her presence filling the entire space. Behind her, the symbol of the cold steel knighthood, eagles, seemed to come to life. The knights moved through the train quickly, using powerful magic to clear out any remaining attackers. One knight unleashed a wide blast of energy, taking down a whole group of them in one go. They moved from car to car, efficiently dealing with anyone who stood in their way. Soon, reports started coming in. The second carriage was clear, then the first. All the passengers were finally safe. A soldier reported to his superior, confirming that the entire train was now secure. The vice captain, a woman named Veronica DeVille, gave the order. They were to escort all the passengers safely to the next station. They finally arrived at Leatherbelk Station. The place was bustling with people. Ludger was sitting alone in a quiet room away from the crowd. That's when Veronica found him. She walked up and asked if he was all right, wondering if the attackers had hurt him. She smiled and formally introduced herself as Veronica DeVille. Ludger was polite but immediately asked if there was a problem. Just then, another man walked up behind her. Veronica confirmed she was the vice captain in charge of the knights. The man showed his badge. He was Romulus, an officer from the Metropolitan Police, and he was there to investigate the attack. Romulus told them there was something odd about the report, which immediately got Ludger's attention. He explained that the attackers took over the train way too quickly. Even with a mage, it shouldn't have been that easy. That's when he dropped the bomb. He believed there was a good chance that someone working on the train was part of the attack. Veronica thought about it for a moment. She had to admit the theory made a lot of sense. Romulus explained that as long as everyone could properly identify themselves, the process would be quick. Veronica chimed in with a grin, telling him it would all be fine as long as he replied honestly. But that was the one thing he couldn't do. He was in serious trouble. Problem wasn't the identity itself. The real Gerard was a man in his mid-40s who had bought his ticket and boarded the train with confidence. The real issue was his own face. No matter how anyone looked at him, he did not look like a man in his 40s. If they investigated him, it was only a matter of time before his cover was blown. And if he was caught, the punishment would be extreme. He'd be lucky if it was over quickly. To make things worse, he could tell the vice captain was the type who showed no mercy to her enemies. She was smiling at him now, but he knew that the second she found anything suspicious, that smile would be gone. Her voice suddenly cut through his thoughts, asking if he was all right. Romulus stepped forward, holding a list of names. He told Ludger not to worry, that he was just confirming everyone's identity, but Ludger was sweating. He was in deep trouble. The officer asked him to show his train ticket if he still had it. After getting the information from a conductor, Romulus read the details aloud. Cabin 403 was assigned to two men, Rudiger Chelsea in his mid-20s and Gerard in his mid-40s. Romulus looked up from the list and asked where the other person was. Ludger calmly explained that after the attack, the man was swept away by the explosion and fell off a cliff as the train passed through the mountains. The officer stared at him, thinking it over. Ludger held his breath, waiting for the man to call his bluff. Just then, Veronica DeVille, the vice captain, stepped in. She told Romulus to wait, explaining that Ludger wasn't a suspect in the first place. The officer was completely caught off guard. She continued, saying that he was fighting the terrorists even before the knights arrived. She asked why a traitor would ever do something like that. Romulus was stunned. This was the first he'd heard of it. It all clicked for Romulus. He apologized immediately, realizing he'd been questioning a hero. The officer then addressed him respectfully as Sir Rudiger. Ludger didn't move, listening as his new identity was accepted as fact. A small smile played on Ludger's lips. He confirmed that it was true, grabbing his case. He stood up and tipped his hat, formally introducing himself as Rudiger Chelsea, the newly appointed man from Theon. Sometime later they arrived at a bustling station. Romulus apologized for the trouble, but Ludger just brushed it off, saying the trip was fine. Romulus then offered to escort him all the way to Theon, insisting that someone so important couldn't travel alone. But Ludger immediately turned him down. He looked at them coldly and said flat out that traveling with the two of them would be uncomfortable. He explained that he had a private matter to attend to, so they didn't need to go out of their way for him. Seeing that he was serious, they finally dropped it. With things settled, Ludger said his goodbyes to Veronica. The knight captain seemed impressed, telling him she hoped they would meet again someday. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling city. He kept moving, putting distance between himself and what had happened on the train. He finally allowed himself a moment of relief. He had actually pulled it off. He thought about the real Rudiger, the man whose identity he'd just stolen. It was thanks to him that he was still alive. He was glad that photography in this world wasn't very advanced. It would be hard for anyone to tell them apart just from a picture. But just as he started to relax, a voice called out from behind him. The man said he'd been expecting him and that he'd seen him talking with the knight. The man introduced himself as Wilford, an employee from Theon Academy. He explained that he'd come to greet him, worried after hearing news of the train attack. Wilford told Ludger he was glad he was safe and gestured towards a carriage, explaining that he would escort him to Theon. Ludger didn't have much of a choice. With no other option, he got in. The carriage started moving through the city streets. Inside, Ludger sat in silence. His mind was racing. He knew he was in serious trouble. For the academy to send someone to personally pick him up, this was not good. He thought about the man Wilford. He was clearly strong and had moved so quietly that Ludger never even heard him approach. This was no ordinary employee, he had to be a knight. He realized trying to run was pointless. Any clumsy excuse would just make him look suspicious, and a man like that would be on him in a second. He thought about his old identity. As long as Gerard was considered gone, he was basically a ghost in this country, which wasn't safe. He decided that having a solid identity, even a stolen one, was his best bet. For now, he would just have to act like Rudiger Chelsea and wait for an opportunity. The carriage pulled up to a massive gate. Wilford announced that they had arrived. He explained that this was Theon. The place was huge, more like a city than a single building. Ludger stared out the window, completely stunned. He had expected a school, not an entire palace. Wilford told him he would take him to see the Chancellor right away, and offered to handle his luggage. The building itself was incredible, more like a grand church than anything else. They walked through a huge, empty hall. The silence was heavy. Finally, they reached a set of large wooden doors. Ludger took a breath and announced himself as Rudiger Chelsea, here to see the Chancellor. Inside, a woman sat behind a desk at the far end of the room. This had to be the Chancellor. She smiled, but her eyes were completely covered in shadow, making it impossible to know what she was thinking. She introduced herself as Alyssa Willow, the Chancellor of Theon. She told him she had been waiting for him. The Chancellor asked if he was all right, having heard about the attack on the train. Ludger told her he was fine, explaining that the knights had arrived to help. She smiled, saying it was a relief. But then she added that it would look bad for the academy if their new professor got injured. Ludger was taken aback for her to talk so openly about appearances. This woman was definitely not your average person. On top of that, he felt something strange about this place. He started to worry, did she somehow know he wasn't the real Rudiger? Her expression was impossible to read, which only made him more nervous. She pushed a document across the desk, telling him to take it. It was his contract. She explained the terms, a 2-year contract, and the academy would provide a place for him to live. He took the paper, already thinking about how fast he could get out of it. But then he saw the salary, 30 imperial gold pieces per month. He couldn't believe his eyes. The Chancellor explained that in their currency, the salary was a massive amount of money. She smiled and asked him if the terms were decent enough. He tried to play it cool, telling her the offer wasn't too bad. But inside, his mind was racing. This wasn't just not too bad, it was a jackpot. He had to force himself to calm down. A salary this high meant they had huge expectations for him. He started to doubt himself. Could he really hide his lack of abilities at Theon, a place filled with geniuses? Besides, his position was already confirmed. If he suddenly refused now, it would look way too suspicious. He was trapped. But then he remembered what he was actually good at, deceiving people and bluffing his way through anything. He decided to sign the contract. He was confident he could put on a good act as a professor. The Chancellor smiled and held out her hand, welcoming him to the academy. They shook hands, sealing the deal. He told himself it was only for 2 years. If he could just survive here that long, he'd finally be free. He was led to a huge mansion that would be his new home. He sat down inside, thinking he had 3 weeks to get ready. It was more than enough time, but he couldn't believe they'd given him the entire mansion to himself. So this was his life now, a professor at the academy. He thought back on the 27 years it had been since he first arrived in this world. He was reborn with all his memories but none of his old powers. With parents who couldn't help him, he had to learn to survive on his own from a young age. After everything he'd been through, he never imagined he'd end up here. This wasn't a real job, it was something he'd been forced into. Still, he needed a new identity anyway. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized Rudiger's life was the perfect cover. The real Rudiger was from a fallen noble family in a small kingdom. He was an only child, his parents were gone, and he had no close friends to speak of. It was perfect, there was nobody who could expose him. This was the best disguise he could have asked for. He decided to start by exploring the academy grounds, but his stomach growled loudly, reminding him he hadn't eaten anything since the train. He figured exploring could wait until tomorrow. First, he needed to find the restaurant. And just like that, 2 weeks flew by. He spent that time getting everything ready for his new job as a professor. He'd managed to gather all the information he needed, and his lecture preparations were going smoothly. With only a week left until the semester started, he felt ready. He decided it was time to head back for orientation. That's when a voice from a nearby table spoke up, saying they were relieved he was safe. His expression hardened instantly. The person in the brown hood just sat there watching him. This clearly wasn't a friendly chat. The hooded figure demanded to know why Ludger had been unreachable for 2 weeks. They said the other members were getting worried, especially since he was a high-ranking first order. He slowly put his cup down on the saucer. He looked up completely calm. He knew this person was here for him. Or to be precise, they were here for the man whose identity he'd stolen, Rudiger Chelsea. The agent quickly explained that the train attack was an accident. Ludger then changed the subject, asking for information on the academy. The agent was confused, reminding him that they'd already sent it over. Ludger smoothly replied that he just wanted to confirm the details he'd been given. Internally, though, he was starting to sweat. This was getting complicated. He knew he had to play along to avoid suspicion, so he asked if their mission was complete. The agent proudly reported that they had already taken out all the main targets at the academy. They'd also found and dealt with a traitor in their ranks. The agent then described the traitor's punishment with a chilling smile. They made sure the person's end was a brutal message to anyone else who might think of betraying them. Hearing the agent's report, Ludger knew this was bad. He was in way over his head. He told himself to stay calm. He had to figure out what was really going on here. The agent started apologizing, saying he should have reported back personally. Ludger had no idea what he was talking about, but he kept a straight face and asked why the agent had suddenly come looking for him. The agent explained that it had been half a month with no word from him. Before he could finish, Ludger cut him off sharply, questioning why he'd taken things into his own hands at such a critical time. He ordered the agent to be quiet, slamming his cup down on the table. He added that the whole suspicious outfit was getting on his nerves. The agent was shaking. Ludger realized this person was absolutely terrified of the real Rudiger. This was something he could definitely use. Now that he had control, Ludger decided it was time for a report. He asked how many of their people were gathered. The agent stammered that 31 third orders and 7 second orders had successfully infiltrated the academy. The agent added that the other first orders were also in position, just as planned. With the situation confirmed, Ludger stood up to leave. He told the agent that for their next meeting, they should use the designated location. The agent looked up, hesitantly asking if Ludger was really ordering him to go to the designated location. Ludger's eyes went ice cold. He turned back slowly and asked if a mere subordinate was really trying to give him orders. The agent immediately started stammering an apology, but Ludger cut him off, saying he didn't want to hear any excuses. He then laid out the rules. He would be the one to decide when they meet, and it would only happen if someone of his rank or higher requested it. The agent clenched his fists, asking nervously if Ludger meant he would only answer to the 0 order. Ludger confirmed it. He told the agent not to bother him with small things unless it was a direct message from their leader. With that, Ludger walked away, leaving the agent standing there completely powerless. The agent was furious. He now realized that Rudiger was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As soon as the agent was gone, Ludger's mind started racing. Assassinations, feeding people to dogs, these guys were completely insane. He had to find a way out of this and fast. But just as he was about to leave, a thought hit him. He stopped and turned back, telling the agent to wait a moment. The agent looked up, clearly confused, and asked what was the matter. Ludger asked him what he was supposed to do if he needed to call them, and that's when it hit him. In all his planning, he'd completely forgotten to figure out a way to contact them. He quickly recovered, putting on an icy glare. He asked the agent if he really needed him to spell everything out. The agent immediately stammered an apology, said goodbye, and then just disappeared. Alone in his room, Ludger started piecing together everything he knew about the real Rudiger Chelsea. A fallen noble with no family. The youngest rank 4 mage in history, and a professor at the best academy in the country. Suddenly, it all made sense. The identity was too perfect. It was a cover designed from the start to earn people's trust. The real Rudiger was a spy. A deep cover agent who couldn't use his true identity while inside the academy. That meant the letters he got weren't just fan mail. They were coded messages from the organization. The weight of it all hit him at once. He ran his hands through his hair, completely overwhelmed. He looked up at the ceiling, his head spinning. Then he just collapsed onto the bed. He wasn't just in trouble. He had accidentally stolen a nuclear bomb. He spread the coded letters out on his desk, trying to make sense of the mission he'd stumbled into. The plan was simple. The organization's agents were to get jobs as professors at the Academy. Once inside, they would report back on everything they found. But the academy wasn't his only problem. He had a whole other group to worry about now. He was caught right in the middle. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. He couldn't believe a high-ranking executive from a secret group would die in a simple terror attack. He thought that someone that important should have been skilled enough to survive. He let out a sigh. It was no use getting angry about a man who was already gone. Either way, he now had 2 groups to keep himself hidden from. There was the Academy and the Secret Association. If either one found him out, it was over. He started to piece together the structure of the secret association. At the top was the zero order, a complete mystery. Below them were the first, second, and third orders. Just knowing that much was a huge step. But the most important thing right now was figuring out who the other first orders were. If they all knew each other personally, they would realize he was a fake the moment they saw him. He just had to hope he didn't get caught. That's when a plan started to form. The best way to survive would be to use Theon to get rid of them. The secret association was powerful, but even they couldn't move freely against an institution like the Academy. He was sweating, the pressure was almost too much. He let out a sigh, his contract was for 2 years. It was clear he wouldn't be enjoying any of it. The semester opening ceremony was about to begin. This was Theon Academy, one of the most powerful and respected places in the world. Inside, the hallways were already full of students and professors, all heading to the same place. The massive lecture hall was packed with students. The opening ceremony was about to begin. As everyone took their seats, the students started to gossip. The rumor was about a new professor taking over a second-year class, which was unusual. Turns out, the previous professor had quit suddenly after losing to a student in a public display of skill. The blue-haired girl turned to her friend Flora and pointed out that everyone was talking about her. Flora looked away, embarrassed. She insisted that all she did was point out a simple mistake in the professor's magic. The gossip then shifted to the new professor. Someone mentioned that he was a noble from a fallen family. Hearing this, the other students figured it would be easy to get good grades from him. But the blue-haired girl just shook her head, clearly thinking they were fools. Just then, a man walked to the front of the lecture hall. He walked up the steps with a confidence that made everyone fall silent. He placed his hand on the podium, his presence filling the entire room. He looked out at the students and introduced himself as their new professor, Rudiger Chelsea. His eyes were sharp and cold, and he scanned the room without a single hint of warmth. The students immediately felt a chill. This was not the easygoing professor they were hoping for. Rudiger explained that since it was still the schedule correction period, he wouldn't be starting lessons just yet. Instead, he had a few announcements to make. He told them that while his classes were about magic manifestation, he wasn't going to waste time on just theory. His focus would be on how to actually use magic in a real fight. He then announced that his class wasn't just for second years. First-year students could also request to join. The room immediately started buzzing with confused whispers. Rudiger raised a hand, calling for silence. He assured them that even with younger students present, he had no intention of lowering the class standards. Just then, a student raised her hand to ask a question. It was Flora. She wanted to know why he was allowing first years into a second-year class. Rudiger simply stated that as a teacher, he believed in giving everyone an equal chance, no matter their year. Flora wasn't satisfied with that answer. She told him he'd need to explain in more detail if he wanted to convince them. But Rudiger just brushed it off, saying it would be boring to spoil everything now. He told everyone that if they were curious, they should just come to the next class. He then said he had one last thing to warn them about. The mood in the room instantly shifted. His eyes went ice cold. He warned that if any student thought they could get an easy grade just because he was a new professor, he would personally make them regret it. He finished by telling them that if that's what they wanted, they shouldn't even bother joining his class. Inwardly, Ludger was hoping his harsh speech would scare most of them away. His plan was simple. Forcing second years to sit with first years would wound their pride, and his warning about a tough class would scare off anyone looking for an easy grade. With his speech finished, he looked out at the silent crowd and asked if there were any questions. The students just whispered among themselves, too scared to speak up. They'd heard rumors that he was from the military, and his cold attitude was terrifying. But one student in the crowd just watched him with a curious smile. Since no one spoke up, Ludger simply announced that the opening ceremony was over. The students filed out of the hall, leaving it empty. Later, Ludger was a little surprised that not a single person had asked a question, but honestly, he was relieved. The fewer people who knew about him, the better. He started to wonder if the students were avoiding him on purpose. He realized he might have come on too strong. Maybe he'd hurt their pride by being so serious. He put the thought aside and started walking down the hall. As he moved, he noticed the students. They all watched him with nervous expressions. It was like they were parting the sea for him, too scared to even get close. He was just thinking how right he was when a voice suddenly called out. A woman with pink hair stood there, smiling. She introduced herself as Selena, another new professor. Ludger returned the greeting, but he could tell she was hesitating. Something was on her mind. After a moment, she finally asked him if he'd eaten yet. Two of them immediately came forward to introduce themselves. One was Brino, the golem professor, and the other was Merelda, who taught illusions. Rudiger introduced himself as the professor of manifestation, figuring this was a get-together for the new hires. Merelda immediately complimented his looks, but Rudiger's attention was drawn to someone else watching them from a distance. The man's stare was cold and calculating. Rudiger met his gaze completely unfazed. For a moment, neither of them looked away. That's when Selena leaned in and whispered to him. The man's name was Chris Benimor. She explained that he was a noble and he acted very differently from commoners like them. Ludger quickly took stock of the group. A noble, a fallen noble, and 3 commoners. It was a strange mix of people. But their social status didn't really matter. Every single one of them was a top expert in their field. And that's what worried him. It meant there was a high chance another First Order was hiding in this group. He couldn't trust anyone. The information he had was too vague and his new colleagues could be lying to his face. That's when Chris Benimor scoffed loudly. He announced that he'd only come because he was curious about the new professors. But all he found was a fallen noble and some commoners. He told them to play by themselves and not get him involved. Ludger just watched him go, his face showing nothing at all. Then Chris turned back, his glare fixed on one person. He warned Kate, the fallen noble, not to get any big ideas about his position here. Merylda was furious. She couldn't believe a noble could be so openly rude. She told Kate not to let it bother him, then turned to Ludger and asked if he'd like to join them for a meal. Bruno immediately agreed, happy to go with them. As they walked toward the dining hall, Ludger felt a small sense of relief. For now, he was just happy he didn't have to eat alone. Later that night, the academy was quiet, but in one of the rooms, a magic circle began to glow. Someone named Polo was using it. They were asking about the new professor, Rudiger Chelsea. The circle fed back information. It listed his incredible achievements, the youngest to reach rank 4, a former military officer, and a famous freelance mage who helped hunt a dangerous creature. Polo stared at the information, wondering if any of it could actually be true. Polo was determined not to let her leader's first lesson be a failure. She decided she had to get as many students as possible to attend. So she got to work, spreading information about the new professor's class across the academy's network. And her plan worked. Students started talking. They were curious about this new class that even first years could join. The day of the first official lesson finally arrived. Ludger walked down the hall, wondering how many people would actually be there after his speech. He was pretty sure he'd scared them off. He'd warned them his class would be tough, so most would probably avoid it. He figured the only ones who'd show up were students who couldn't get into any other class. He reached the door, expecting to see maybe 30 students at most. Turns out the post about the new professor was getting a lot of attention. Students were talking, and their curiosity was growing. When he opened the door to the lecture hall, he stopped dead in his tracks. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The room was completely full. Every single one of the 80 seats was taken. As he walked in, the entire atmosphere changed. The students whispered among themselves, feeling the pressure from his military background. This was the worst possible outcome. He felt like someone was actively trying to ruin his plan. But then he stopped. Maybe he had just underestimated the students. He remembered where he was. Surin Academy was home to the most talented students on the continent. A simple warning wasn't going to scare them off. He realized his mistake. His harsh warning didn't scare them off, it just made them more eager to take on the challenge. He let out a quiet sigh. There was no getting out of this now, he just had to face it. He stood before the class and introduced himself again as Rudiger Chelsea. He explained that he would be teaching them the entire process of manifestation. Suddenly, a student raised his hand and cut in. He wanted to know if Ludger really meant he'd be teaching all 4 main specializations. Ludger's eyes narrowed. The student immediately looked nervous. Ludger told him not to ask questions unless he was given permission. He said he'd let it go just this once. He then laid down the rules for everyone else. Anyone who dared to interrupt him again would have points taken away. Of course, he added that there would be ways to earn points too. With the rules set, he finally answered the question. He confirmed that yes, he would be teaching all 4 main specializations. He laid out the 4 main specializations of manifestation: release, attributed elements, telekinesis, and strengthening. This was the foundation of all magic. The students started whispering to each other. Most professors struggled to teach just 2 of those specializations. They were convinced he was just exaggerating, a new professor teaching all 4 at once. It sounded ridiculous. But Ludger wasn't bothered by their doubts. He told them that since it was the first lesson, he'd show them something to get their attention. He started to cast a rank 3 fire spell called Flame Bolt. He explained that it was a complex technique, combining 7 different factors like heat and acceleration. As he spoke, a massive glowing magic circle formed right in front of him. Then he dropped the bombshell. He told them the method he just used would let them cast spells at least 3 times faster than anything they'd ever seen before. The students were stunned. Cutting down the time to cast a spell like that, they thought it had to be a lie. The students started whispering among themselves, completely thrown off. One of them turned to Flora, the top student, and asked if what the professor was saying was even true. But before Flora could even answer, a bold student with blue hair spoke up. She calmly stated that what he was suggesting was impossible unless you changed the fundamental structure of the magic itself. She mentioned the common shortcuts, like using a scroll with magic already stored in it. But she pointed out that these methods were limited and not a true solution. She looked straight at the professor, her eyes sharp. With a confident smirk, she told Ludger that if he was just talking about simple tricks like that, she would be really disappointed in him. Ludger just stood there unfazed. He could see everyone had questions, so he announced he would take a few. A second year named Alex Saline immediately asked what he meant by reducing manifestation time. Ludger bluntly replied that it meant exactly what it sounded like, then called for the next question. A first year named Dahlia then asked if his plan was to improve the technique itself. The professor shook his head. He explained that changing a completed technique would just turn it into a different spell entirely. His method, he said, would keep the magic exactly the same, but simply reduce the time it takes to cast. The blue-haired student raised her hand again. She flat out told him that what he was claiming was impossible. Instead of answering with words, Ludger just clenched his fist. He looked at them, his eyes sharp and serious. He was done talking. It was time to show them. She wasn't backing down. She repeated that what the professor was claiming was impossible. The other students started whispering. They were sure the new professor was finished. But Ludger was calm. He told her he hadn't allowed comments, but he'd make an exception. He then asked why she was so convinced it couldn't be done. The student explained that the only way to get faster was through endless practice. She said he was claiming to do something that even the greatest geniuses in history couldn't do. Because of that, she told him directly that she just couldn't believe him. Ludger listened, then flipped the whole argument around. He asked her what if it wasn't that they couldn't improve magic, but that they just didn't. He told them that magic had gotten stuck because everyone cared too much about tradition. Meanwhile, science was always moving forward, threatening to leave magic behind. He looked right at the student. He told her she was wrong. No one had ever tried to improve it, so he was going to be the first. The student couldn't believe what she was hearing. His confidence was just shameless. Ludger decided explaining wasn't enough. He turned to the student Flora and asked her how long it usually takes to cast a flame bolt. Flora answered calmly. She explained that the time depends on the mage rank. The higher the rank, the faster the cast. Ludger agreed, but then he dismissed the entire idea. He said he wasn't talking about the slow process of ranking up. His method was different, designed for students at their level. Flora considered it, then said it would take at least 5 seconds for a normal student. But she added with a smirk that she could do it much faster than that. Ludger seemed amused by her confidence. He challenged her to come to the front and show everyone just how fast she was. Without hesitation, Flora walked to the front of the class. She began to draw the magic circle on the floor. The other students watched, completely amazed. They whispered about how fast she was, recognizing her as the famous Lumos's daughter. Ludger checked his pocket watch. He told Flora her speed was incredible for a second-year student. He admitted her execution was flawless, but then he added that it was slow. Flora was completely stunned, slow. She tried to argue, explaining that even the record for a third-rank mage was slower than her time. Ludger just repeated himself. He said her speed was very slow. He just looked at her with this smug expression, completely unimpressed. The other students started whispering. If Flora's speed was considered slow, just how fast could this new professor possibly be? Without another word, Ludger raised his hand. A tiny spark of light appeared at his fingertip. Flora watched him, her eyes narrowed. She knew the technique for flame bolt, and whatever he was doing, this wasn't it. Before anyone could even blink, a massive, perfect magic circle erupted at his feet. Flora and the blue-haired student just stared, completely speechless. The entire class was in an uproar. They couldn't believe it. The spell had been cast in less than a second. But she realized something even crazier. He hadn't just been fast. He'd skipped all the normal steps for casting a spell. Ludger looked at their shocked faces and calmly offered to do it again, just in case they missed it. And just like that, another perfect magic circle appeared instantly. He looked around the room. Their expressions had finally changed from doubt to pure shock. But then Ludger dropped another bomb. He told them the spell he'd been casting wasn't even Flame Bolt to begin with. Ludger explained that while he did use Flame Bolt, what they really saw was something different. It was a technique to use a technique. The students were completely lost. A technique to use a technique. It didn't make any sense. Ludger then started to explain. He described it as a blueprint. He said magicians use their bodies as hardware and their magic power is the data. He continued, saying that the spells themselves are like software, and the program that runs it all, he called it source code. The blue-haired student was stunned. Source code? She had never heard of anything like it in her life. She stared at Ludger, wondering just who this man really was. Ludger's attention then turned to the students who had questioned him. He asked Flora Lumos if he had answered her questions. The blue-haired girl just looked down, sweating. He looked at her coldly. He pointed out that she had interrupted his class without permission, all because her own mind was too closed to new ideas. He asked if she agreed. She couldn't even look him in the eye. She quietly admitted that he was right. Ludger told her that her actions weren't just questions. They were a direct attack on a teacher's authority in his own classroom. And because of that, he announced that Flora Lumos would be penalized points. She just stood there, completely stunned. The other students couldn't believe it. Penalizing Flora, no one saw that coming. But just as the shock settled in, Ludger spoke again. He wasn't finished. He then told her that the flame bolt she had demonstrated was perfect. For that, he was giving her 10 points. He explained that he doesn't dislike skilled students. In fact, he told Flora she was excellent. Flora looked up, completely thrown off by the sudden praise. She managed to thank him. The other students let out a sigh of relief. The 10-point penalty and the 10-point reward canceled each other out perfectly. Flora just smiled, coolly telling her friend Cheryl not to worry about her. Cheryl let out a sigh of relief. She figured someone like Flora could brush off a little pressure easily. With the confrontation over, the students all settled back into their seats. But Flora's smile faded. She was seriously thinking about what the professor had just shown her. At the front of the room, Ludger picked up his coat. He announced it was time to officially start the class. He then dropped a bombshell. He would teach his special technique, source code, but only to a select few students who did well. If they wanted to learn it, they'd have to work for it. The entire room was buzzing. Suddenly, every student was paying very close attention. One student started to sweat. He'd heard bad things about the new professor, but now he was starting to think he'd stumbled into the most important class of his life. The student with glasses was practically glowing. He knew he had come to the right place. Just then, the clock chimed. Ludger announced that class was over for the day. He told them all to head back and review what they had just learned. As the students filed out, the whole room was buzzing. They couldn't believe they'd gotten to see something like source code in person. But one student just scoffed. He looked down on the others for being so impressed, thinking to himself that this was why commoners were worthless. He held his book tightly, watching the other students leave with a sharp, calculating look in his eyes. The arrogant student stood on the stairs, looking down on the classroom. The student with glasses just watched him quietly from his desk. The lecture hall was almost empty, but the tension was still there. Suddenly, the noble whirled around and accused the other student of mocking him. The student with glasses panicked, quickly trying to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. But the noble wasn't listening. He got angry, shouting about how he was the eldest son of Baron Felio. He then sighed, wondering aloud how the academy could let in students who weren't from important families. That's when a third student stepped in. He shot back that it was better than letting in some idiot just because his father was a baron. The noble's face twisted with rage. He was not used to being talked to like that. The noble was furious. He pulled out his wand, its tip glowing with magic, and threatened to make them pay for insulting him. But the student who had stepped in, Leo, just stared back, completely unimpressed. The noble froze, stunned by his calmness. That's when Leo dared him to try it. Leo stepped forward, putting his foot right on the desk between them. He told him to go ahead and see what would happen. He reminded the noble that the academy wouldn't just ignore an attack, regardless of his family name. Everyone had received a notice about fighting before they even enrolled. He then told him to take a look around. They weren't alone, and everyone was watching him cause a scene. The noble's eyes darted around the room. He could see the other students whispering and staring. He was completely cornered. Humiliated, he could only manage one last empty threat, telling them to just wait before backing down. With the noble gone, the student with glasses turned to the one who had helped him. He smiled and introduced himself as Aiden. The blue-haired student, Leo, told him not to bother with thanks. He explained that he only stepped in because he couldn't stand arrogant nobles. Leo seemed annoyed by Aiden's sincere kindness. He shook his head and said he was leaving. But Aiden wasn't ready to part ways yet. He called out, wanting to go with him, but Leo just asked if he even knew where he was going. Aiden pointed to the book Leo was holding. It was for an alchemy class, which happened to be his next class too. Leo stopped and looked at him. He told Aiden he should try to be less obvious, but Aiden had no idea what he meant. Leo spelled it out for him. He said it was clear that Aiden was a country kid, a commoner who didn't know much about magic. He warned Aiden that he needed to learn how things worked at Theon, especially since some of the older students were overwhelmingly powerful. Leo started by naming the most obvious one, Flora Lumos, the second-year student who had challenged the professor. Aiden remembered her immediately. Next on the list was someone even more important, Erendir von Exilion, the third princess of the Empire. Leo warned him that commoners like them should stay far away from royalty. Aiden realized he had seen her in class earlier. Finally, he pointed out the leader of the largest group of nobles in the second year, a guy named Proyden Walberg. Aiden's stomach dropped. He remembered the arrogant noble from before. Turns out he was part of that same group. He wondered if he'd already gotten on their bad side. But Aiden didn't seem too worried. Leo looked at him, unable to tell if he was brave or just didn't get the danger he was in. Leo told him there were still more people to watch out for and he'd explain on the way. Aiden just smiled and asked if he wanted to get lunch together. Leo looked at him, completely stunned by the simple offer. Meanwhile, Professor Ludger walked alone through the sunlit halls of the academy. He walked alone, thinking about what had just happened. He couldn't help but smile. The students' reactions were way better than he'd expected. He thought about this world. It was like 19th century Earth, but with magic. Because of that, their science was way behind. That's why his source code, a mix of magic and science, was such a big deal. He honestly had no idea it would work so well. He remembered showing his ideas to his old teacher. The man had just said it wasn't bad, so Ludger didn't have high hopes. He knew source code had its limits. It was fast, but it only worked for lower rank magic and was a pain to create. He couldn't rely on just that one trick. If he didn't want to get caught, he needed to prepare a lot more things to teach. He stopped in front of a large door with a plaque. This must be his personal office. He opened the door to his new office. But he wasn't alone. A woman with long white hair was already standing inside. She smiled, welcoming him and complimenting the room's design. Ludger did not look happy about the surprise visitor. She explained that the school provides all professors with their own personal space to use however they want. Ludger sat down and got straight to the point. He asked why she was here, saying her presence was a bit of a burden. The woman just laughed. She said that as the chancellor, it was her job to take care of a precious new professor like him. She watched him with a sharp, knowing look. Ludger felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way she looked at him was deeply unsettling. The chancellor noted how calm he was, saying she expected him to be more shocked. Ludger thought to himself that he was already shocked enough. In his mind, he was screaming. This was more shocking than running into a ghost. He couldn't understand how she got into his office before he did. The chancellor casually mentioned that all the other new professors were shocked, too. She then explained that he was the last one she was visiting. Ludger's mind raced. If she visited everyone else first, why was he last? A terrible thought crossed his mind. He wondered if she was onto him. He figured that no matter how well hidden the secret association was, the chancellor would know about any strange activity at the school. He was sure she suspected him. The whole thing felt completely unfair. He was being treated like a high-ranking member of a secret society he was only pretending to be a part of. The chancellor suddenly changed the topic. She mentioned hearing that he had accepted new students for his lecture. Ludger confirmed it, explaining that he had no intention of limiting his class to just 1 year. The chancellor told him she wasn't there to blame him. In fact, she said she was in favor of his teaching methods. She then mentioned that since the princess was in his class, he had to make sure there were no problems. It would be a huge issue if anything happened to her. Ludger's mind went blank. The princess. This just made his already impossible situation 10 times worse. The chancellor just smiled warmly, telling him she had high expectations for him. She was glad his first lesson went so well. With the students' good feedback, she felt a lot less worried about him. She explained that she had a lot of work to do, so she had to get going. With a final word of encouragement, she turned to leave. She opened the door and stepped out of his office. She wasn't alone. An older man with a monocle was waiting for her in the hall. The first thing he asked was for her opinion on the new professor. He asked her directly if Professor Rudiger was someone they could actually trust. The chancellor's eyes narrowed as she thought about the train terrorism case. With so many undercovers at the academy, she couldn't afford to miss a single detail. She wondered if the whole thing was a trick. What if, in all the chaos, the real person had been swapped out for someone else? She turned to the man beside her, Wilford, and asked him what he thought. Wilford admitted he wasn't sure yet, but he was certain the new professor was definitely not an average person. He said it was just an old man's gut feeling. The Chancellor knew his people-watching skill was incredibly reliable. Still, Wilford decided he couldn't trust anything Ludger said. He would have to watch him more closely. Back in his office, Ludger was losing his mind. He was screaming on the inside. Private interview, he knew that was a lie. That wasn't a friendly chat, it was a full-blown interrogation. He started looking through the student records. The first thing that stood out was the Lumos family, the highest nobles in the land. Pushy, the anxiety aside, started to worry, hoped they wouldn't hold it against him. He tried to reassure himself. He'd even given her a merit point as a kind of apology. Surely that was enough. As he kept reading, he realized just how many important students were in his class. There was a prophet from the Magic Tower and even a princess from the Exilian Empire. But then one of the files caught his eye. He looked at the student's picture. Compared to all the others, this one seemed out of place. And then it hit him, he felt like he'd seen the student somewhere before. His hand tightened, something wasn't right. He decided to put the thought aside for now. He figured he'd remember where he'd seen her later. Either way, he couldn't lower his guard. Based on how the Black Dawn was acting, he knew they didn't fully trust him yet. He wondered if it would be easier to just fully commit to the secret society. He thought back to the man on the train who called him a first order. That man saw the real Rudiger, but accepted his own face without question. This meant the real Rudiger was an expert in disguise, and now everyone expected him to be one too. He immediately shook the thought away. The risk was too high. If he got caught, there was no guarantee they'd let him live. He sighed, for now he just had to do his best as a professor and play it safe. That's when he heard a knock at his door. A man stood in the doorway, nervously holding out a piece of paper. He said he was there to deliver the patrol schedule for Professor Rudiger. Ludger took the paper. It was his patrol schedule. He vaguely remembered seeing something about it in his contract. With the schedule delivered, the man quickly took his leave. He glanced at the paper, patrol duty. It sounded easy enough, just another part of the job. But elsewhere in the academy, things weren't so quiet. In one of the training halls, a confrontation was starting. Flora Lumos glared at the other student, angrily demanding she repeat what she just said. But the silver-haired girl, Renee, didn't back down. She stated firmly that she had no reason to leave. She told them the training hall was for everyone. If they had a problem with her being there, they could leave instead. Flora just smirked. She couldn't believe a commoner was talking back to her. Renee shot back, reminding them that Thean Academy doesn't divide students by their family name or title. The blonde noble, Dynama, just scoffed. She called that rule a dumb saying meant only to make commoners feel better. Her friends laughed along, mocking how the lower-class students always try to crawl their way up. Dynama told her that no one was listening anyway. She demanded that Renee get on her knees and beg for forgiveness for being a commoner. But Renee didn't say a word. She just closed her eyes and turned her back on them. While her friends laughed about the commoner leaving, Dynama's face twisted with anger. She couldn't believe she was being ignored. She called Renee a little dog, her knuckles white as she gripped her wand. Bright green magic flared to life around her. She pointed her wand right at Renee, screaming about being ignored. Furious at being ignored, Dynama unleashed a powerful spell, aiming it directly at Renee's back. Her friends cried out in shock, not expecting her to actually attack another student. The blast of magic slammed into Renee. Her eyes widened as the spell hit her. She let out a scream as the energy exploded around her. But then the spell just vanished. Dynama spun around, furious, demanding to know who dared to interfere. A cold voice cut through the tension. It was Ludger. He called them out for daring to fight in a place meant for training. He then corrected himself, saying it couldn't even be called a fight. Below, Renee looked up, surprised to see who had stepped in to help her. He looked down at them from the top of the stairs. He told them they must think the academy was a joke to be causing such a big problem on the first day. Renee looked up, completely surprised. She couldn't believe it was Professor Rudiger. He floated down to the ground. He explained that if it had been a fair fight, he would have just given a warning. But this was clearly a one-sided attack. Dynama yelled back, asking what the problem was. She claimed she was just protecting her family's honor. Ludger immediately shut her down, reminding her that all students at the academy are equals. He stared at her, his expression completely serious. He wasn't buying any of her excuses. Ludger continued, telling her that he didn't care how noble her family was. He wasn't going to overlook what she did. Dynama's face twisted with anger. He then gave a simple command. She was to follow him immediately. She was shaking with rage. In her mind, she cursed him out, unable to believe a fallen noble would dare to treat her this way. Ludger didn't move, he just stood there waiting. Dynama couldn't believe it, she was completely stunned. Even her friends were confused, calling out her name nervously. Renee just watched, unsure of what was happening. That's when Ludger slowly began to turn his head. He looked back at her with a cold smile and asked her to repeat what she just said. He took a single step forward. Then he reached out and grabbed her shoulder. She flinched, the pressure in his grip making her wince. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She couldn't believe what was happening. He told her that what she'd said was a direct challenge to his rights as a professor. He stared down at her, asking if he was wrong. He decided he would let her words slide as a mistake, but he made it clear she would be punished for attacking her classmate. With that, he turned the matter over to another professor, Selena. She looked surprised but quickly agreed to handle it. His decision made, Ludger turned and walked away, leaving everyone else to deal with the consequences. Renee was stunned. She couldn't believe Professor Rudiger actually knew her name. She'd always felt invisible, just a commoner lost in a class of 80 people. But after what he did, she realized he wasn't just scary. He was someone she could actually trust. With a new sense of hope, she decided she was going to work harder than ever. Later that night, the campus was quiet, but Ludger was sitting alone on a bench, clearly in a lot of pain. He clutched his head, trying to fight off whatever was happening to him. He desperately reached inside his coat for something. He finally took his medicine, letting out a breath as the pain started to fade. He knew that without it, he would have been in serious trouble. He thought about how unlucky he'd been. The timing of that incident was terrible, and he'd almost completely lost his composure. He remembered the first signs of trouble appearing back at the training grounds. It was still manageable then, but the symptoms got way worse. He had to leave, but he couldn't just pretend he didn't hear the students yelling. He thought he did an okay job hiding it, but he was worried his face looked strange the whole time. He looked down at the bottle. It was the last one he had packed. This was getting dangerous. He knew he had to get in contact with his supplier as soon as possible. The next day, Ludger was in a meeting with some other professors. He listened as one of them brought up a werewolf and asked if that's what they were really talking about. The professor with pink hair confirmed it. They were definitely talking about a werewolf. She explained that some students who went to Leatherbelf the day before saw a dark figure moving across the rooftops in the fog. Another professor at the table just thought it sounded like a city ghost story. That's when Ludger spoke up. He mentioned that there was supposedly a witness inside Theon as well. Professor Selena agreed it was possible. She explained that with all the magic in Theon, strange things sometimes happen. Plus, the city already had its own ghost stories. The professor with purple hair teased her, pointing out that she seemed to know a lot about ghost stories. Selena got completely flustered. She quickly insisted that she wasn't really interested in them and had only researched the topic to find things to talk about with her students. The other professor just smirked and changed the subject. She turned to Ludger, commenting on how he made a pretty big impression on his first day. The professor with purple hair tried to recall the name of his magic, the one that speeds up casting time. That's when Professor Selena remembered it. It was called Source Code. The conversation seemed to stop as Ludger walked by. All eyes were on him. The professor with purple hair asked him directly if the rumors were true. Ludger simply confirmed they were, without any hesitation. Both of them were stunned. They couldn't believe that such a thing was actually possible. And it wasn't just them. All the other professors in the room were whispering about him too. Ludger just listened, his expression unreadable. She explained that everyone was interested in his magic now that the rumors had spread. Ludger just calmly asked what she meant by his magic. He thought to himself that it was better this way. There was no point in getting a patent for it. He knew that if you didn't watch your back in this world, you'd get taken advantage of. Unless, of course, the magic tower decided they wanted you first. The real problem was that the other professors were already coming after him. One of them, Chris Benimor, looked like he was ready to get rid of him right then and there. But other professors weren't the only danger. His mind drifted to the rumors about a werewolf. Somewhere in that same city, under the full moon, something was stirring. On a rooftop, a man with long silver hair looked down at the streets below. He decided to the area. And there it was, a werewolf hunched over and ready to strike. Without warning, the creature lunged forward with incredible speed. But the man was just as fast, dodging the attack with ease. The blue-haired man moved in a flash, striking the werewolf down with a single, powerful blow. The creature lay smoking on the ground. The man looked down and asked if this weak ambush was the best it could do after all this time. But the werewolf just laughed. It complained that he could have at least pretended to be surprised. Then the creature started to change. As its body shifted back to human form, it greeted the man respectfully, saying it had been a while. The long-haired man Rudiger sighed. He asked the werewolf what kind of trouble he'd gotten himself into this time, sounding like this was a regular thing. The werewolf Hans looked furious. He complained that he never wanted to end up like this. Rudiger couldn't help but laugh, telling Hans he was born to be funny. Hans snapped back, telling him not to laugh since it wasn't happening to him. He felt like he was cursed, explaining that he's actually a human with a special trait that causes this. Hans asked if Rudiger brought the antidote. Rudiger held up a syringe filled with a glowing green liquid. Without waiting, Hans injected the antidote into his neck. He sighed in relief, saying he couldn't walk around looking like a werewolf. The effect was immediate. The fur began to pull back as his body started to change. In moments, Hans was completely human again. He thanked Rudiger, admitting that without him, he would have been stuck like that for days, just like the first time they met. He remembered that first meeting. He was supposed to be hunting a dangerous creature, but instead he ran into a giant chihuahua. The next thing he knew, he'd turned into a chihuahua man himself. Hans shuddered, saying if Rudiger hadn't been there to help, he might not have survived. Hans rubbed his neck, trying to piece things together. He remembered something about a letter and asked Rudiger what exactly had happened. Somewhere else in the city, laughter echoed through the dark streets. A woman named Chelsea was completely amazed. She told Rudiger that she would have been caught stammering in that situation and asked how he managed it. He just sighed, saying he had no choice if he wanted to live. She couldn't help but laugh at the idea of him being part of some secret organization called the First Order. She stopped laughing and thought about the name for a moment. She asked Rudiger if he knew anything about them. She searched her memory. She recalled hearing about some new group that had recently appeared in the underworld, calling themselves some kind of order. Then it hit her the name of the group was Black Dawn. With that settled, she handed Rudiger his bag. She mentioned that she hadn't opened it, adding that she probably couldn't have even if she tried. Rudiger opened his case and took out a small vial. He pointed out that since both he and Hans relied on medicine, they had something in common. But he had a more important question. He asked Hans why he'd made him wait for 2 days, especially when the letter he sent said to meet immediately. Hans looked completely lost. He had no idea what letter Rudiger was talking about. A tense silence fell between them. Something was clearly wrong here. That's when Rudiger's expression went cold. He seemed to be putting the pieces together. But Hans wasn't looking at him anymore. He stared past Rudiger in absolute terror, stammering in disbelief. Perched on a rooftop under the full moon was a real werewolf. The creature snarled, its fangs dripping. Hans cursed under his breath. The rumors were actually true. Hans wanted to run, but Rudiger stopped him. He explained that the creature hadn't seen them yet, and if they moved, it would attack instantly. It was looking for prey. That's when Hans noticed something odd. There was a shiny metal tag hanging from the werewolf's neck. He pointed it out, wondering aloud if someone had put it there on purpose. That settled it for Rudiger. He opened his case and pulled out a revolver, deciding they had to check it out right now. Seeing the gun, Hans remarked that he hadn't seen it in a long time. Not since Rudiger was an active cryptid hunter. He even remembered the alias Rudiger used back then. It was Van Helsing. Rudiger didn't respond. He just started walking forward, ready to face the creature. The werewolf snarled, its massive fangs dripping. It was ready for a fight. A bright flash of energy slammed down right in front of the werewolf. The force of the blast sent the creature stumbling backward. But it wasn't hurt, it was just angry, its eyes glowing with rage. The creature let out a furious howl. Rudiger knew he'd get his answers once he took the monster down. That's when Rudiger started to move. He took a single step and blue energy rippled out from his feet. He was unbelievably fast. The werewolf lunged again and again, but Rudiger dodged every single attack like it was nothing. He stopped, standing perfectly still, not even breaking a sweat. The werewolf charged one last time, claws out, ready to tear him apart. But Hans wasn't worried at all. He just stood there completely calm. A small smile appeared on his face. He knew exactly what to do. He unleashed an invisible wave of force. The werewolf was hit hard, unable to defend itself. The creature collapsed to the ground, completely taken down. Hans stood over it. The fight finished in an instant. But someone else was watching from the shadows. He couldn't understand what just happened, wondering why the werewolf suddenly went down. The werewolf was twisting in pain. Hans explained that he had used a supersonic sound that only the creature could hear, giving it a massive headache. The man in hiding pulled out a syringe. He decided he needed to find out who was making these things. But just then Hans whipped his head around. He sensed something was off. Just then he heard shouting from below. The police were here. Of all the bad timing, this was the worst. Suddenly, a sharp pain hit his head. The supersonic sound wasn't just for the werewolf. He knew he had to get out of there. He threw a grappling hook towards a nearby building. The hook, shaped like a bat, soared through the night. From the rooftop, Hans just watched him swing away into the darkness. A man and a werewolf were racing across the top of a train at incredible speed. The werewolf looked over its shoulder. The man was closing in fast as they sped through a station. Then the man attacked, throwing a volley of silver stars. But the creature didn't slow down. It just snarled and kept charging. It launched itself at him, claws ready to strike. As the weapons flew through the air, the man called out the werewolf's name, Vivo. One of the silver stars struck Vivo on the side of his face. But the man wasn't celebrating. He calmly noted that Vivo had good senses, implying he dodged the worst of it. The man unleashed a powerful blast of blue energy from his hands. It slammed right into Vivo, engulfing him completely. But the man wasn't impressed. He thought the werewolf was weak. He swung his weapon, sending another wave of energy slicing through the creature just snarled, completely unfazed. Vivo leaped back across the roof of the train. The man Kova just stood there watching him. The pause didn't last long. Vivo charged forward again, a blur of speed. Kova raised his weapon, ready to meet the attack head-on. Kova slammed his fist right into the werewolf's face. The weapon on his hand glowed with intense blue light. He pulled his arm back. The werewolf's eyes were now glowing with the same blue energy, completely stunned. The creature's body just fell apart, its silhouette scattering into the night. Miles away, a man named Choa was walking nervously down an empty street. He muttered to himself that he'd almost been caught. Apparently, someone was trying to capture the werewolf, and he was getting worried. Suddenly, he stopped. Something was wrong. And then he saw it, a werewolf lying dead on the cobblestone street. Suddenly, Kova appeared right behind him. Choa jumped, yelling at him for sneaking up and complaining that he almost dropped his bag. They stood over the dead werewolf. Choa asked if Kova was really just going to leave it there. Kova said yes, explaining that his investigation was finished. Kova admitted he just wanted to surprise him. Choa grinned, joking that at least Kova succeeded at that, unlike his own recent mission. Then Kova dropped the real news. After checking, he discovered the creature wasn't a real cryptid at all. It was an artificial test subject that someone had made. This changed everything. Kova said they needed to push their plans forward. He thought it was time they found a place to settle down. Choa was worried. He asked if Kova was serious, listing all the dangers in the city. But Kova explained that the chaos was actually a good thing. It would divide everyone's attention. Kova told him that he was under suspicion and couldn't move freely. He ordered Choa to gather information for now and said he would step up later to gather allies. They looked back at the creature. The fact that someone could create an artificial werewolf meant they were dealing with a very powerful and dangerous enemy. With the werewolf taken care of, he hoped he could finally stay out of trouble. But the city of Leatherbelk had other problems. An unidentified killer was still on the loose. According to the news, the number of deaths had now exceeded 10. The culprit was still unknown, but all the witnesses described the same thing, a terrifying beast with black fur. Rudiger Chelsea read the paper carefully. The police claimed it was just a crazy killer they would soon capture, but the city was still terrified. Then he saw the date of the latest attack. It was Sunday, but he had gotten rid of the werewolf on Saturday. His eyes widened. Could there be more than one? Just then, a small globe on his desk began to glow with a bright blue light. The scene changes to a grand hall, where a meeting of professors was about to begin. One of the women at the table spotted him and waved him over, calling out his name. As he walked over, the others started whispering. They'd heard rumors that he'd invented some incredible new magic, and they were curious about the man they knew as a fallen noble. The professor next to him leaned in with some bad news. 2 first-year students had been attacked the night before. She explained they were alive, but barely. The wounds looked like they came from a wild animal. This confirmed her fears. The rumors about a beast loose in Leatherbelk were true, and now it was inside the academy. Just then, another professor announced that the chancellor was arriving and told everyone to be quiet. The woman next to Ludger whispered that the professor was Marios, a pharmacology expert who'd been at Theon for over 20 years. A woman with long white hair walked to the front of the hall. This was the chancellor. She got straight to the point, calling an urgent meeting to make an announcement. An assailant had entered Theon. She confirmed that 2 students were severely wounded last night, and according to the witnesses, the attacker was a werewolf. But one of the professors slammed his hands on the table and stood up. He told the chancellor she had to be mistaken, calling the idea of a cryptid impossible. The chancellor stared back at him, her expression cold. She called him out by his full name, Professor Hugo Borutag, and asked if he had something to say. Professor Hugo wasn't intimidated. He started by reminding everyone that they were in Theon Academy, a place protected by the entire empire. He scoffed at the idea of a werewolf being in a place like this, telling the chancellor she shouldn't believe in ghost stories spread by students. But the professor just smiled. He said he heard her perfectly, and that's exactly why he didn't think it was a werewolf. He pointed out that both victims were nobles. The room went quiet. The chancellor seemed to be thinking hard about what he just said. That's when Professor Hugo made his real accusation. He believed the attacker wasn't a monster at all, but a commoner student from Theon.